What is the best alternate magic system for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons? Well, I think I found it, and in fact, I think this is the magic system that I would want to replace the 5th edition magic system with. And by the way, we're talking about arcane magic here. We're not talking about divine magic. That's something else. We're talking about a new system for arcane magic that I think is the one that I would prefer to use. I recently found this one in the World of Aetaltis Player's Guide. I've been talking about this a lot. I've talked with its creator on the channel before. We went over it on the Morning Grind. But I wanted to take a look at its magic system specifically in more detail and talk about what I think is so great about it. Now, of course, to a lot of people, the Vancian kind of magic where you memorize a spell and then it disappears from your memory once you've cast it, I mean, that's very classic Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, I played that way quite a bit. I mean, a lot for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd edition, and then 3rd edition. You know, that kind of tradition of that kind of magic system has been carrying over in Dungeons & Dragons for a long time. And of course, you know, there are vestiges and elements of that that are still very present in 5th edition. And I do like the 5th edition spell slot system and everything that it's doing. Played quite a bit of 5th edition using that magic system. But then I found this one, and of course, it's specifically designed for the world of Aetaltis and the way that Aetaltis works, and all of its, you know, campaign building and world building and all of that. But really, I think it's plug and play to be able to be used in any Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And I think that I would certainly think about using this magic system for any type of campaign that I was playing that's based on the 5th edition rules. To me, it makes Magic work a lot more like I kind of think Magic works. Now, of course, how you think Magic works, that's kind of, you know, very setting dependent. But, you know, when I was thinking about, you know, how would wizards be able to cast spells, I had never thought of the memorization techniques and the spell slots and things like that. That, to me, is very much something that was created for Dungeons & Dragons. When I think of Magic a bit more generally, as far as fantasy goes, I start to think about something like mana or essence or points to cast spells. Does it make sense that wizards forget spells and that kind of thing? So I was extremely happy when I found the magic system here in Aetaltis. So we're going to go over it right now. Now, there's a whole chapter dedicated to magic in Aetaltis, and we're going to go over it in detail, but first, they actually have a great summary of exactly what is different between this magic system and 5th edition. So we're going to go to that first. So if you want an overview, here's the overview, and then we can get into it in more detail in a moment. So here is the difference between glyph magic, and glyph magic, that's what the world of Aetaltis calls this particular magic system. So the difference between this magic system, glyph magic, and the standard 5th edition spellcasting rules in bullet point format. So the first is a spell point system. Glyph magic is a spell point system. It limits the number of spells you can cast by giving you a pool of points to spend rather than a number of spell slots, which I would like. Each spell has a spell point cost to cast, and then when you are out of spell points, casting additional spells becomes extremely difficult or impossible. It's not necessarily impossible, it may be impossible depending on the level of the spell and other things perhaps, but it becomes much more difficult, so you're not out of spells in the event of emergency situation. It's just very much difficult, and there may be negatives and consequences to it. Spell points in these rules are called essence points because they are used for more than just spells. No memorization. An arcane spellcaster does not need to memorize spells in advance. As long as the spell has been transcribed into their spell book and they have enough essence points, they can try to cast it. So it does maintain the idea of learning spells and transcribing them into the spell book. But what you're doing, we're going to be reducing the number of steps between the spell in the spell book and the wizard being able to cast the spell. That's one of the problems that I have with 5th edition. You know, it's not overly complex when you really get down to it and you're, you know, you actually study the rules and you know what you're doing as far as a spellcaster goes. But I've found that when you're initially trying to explain spellcasting, you know, arcane spellcasting to somebody who is new to 5th edition, there are many different layers to being able to actually get that spell cast as a wizard. Having it, just because you have it in your spell book doesn't mean that you've actually prepared it, and then you have a certain number of spell slots, and you can cast the spells at different spell slots for different power, and then you're using up spell slots, which is actually different from divine casting. The divine casting is actually easier and more direct than that. Now, supposedly, of course, the wizard has more flexibility, and the spell casting can know more spells and so forth. I get all of that, but I would be for a more direct path for arcane spell casting as well, and this provides that. Skill roll. To reflect the complexity of casting arcane spells in Aetaltis, casting a spell with a glyph requires a spellcasting check. This roll doubles as the attack roll when one is necessary. The DC to resist spells' effects is calculated as described in the standard 5th edition spellcasting rules. I am generally for, when a player is casting a spell, the player should be rolling the dice in order to make the spell have its effect. As it stands right now in 5th edition, spells originally earlier in Dungeons & Dragons had been written in a very ad hoc way. How does this spell work? Well, there's no way to know other than just, hey, read the spell and apply its effects. Now, of course, read the spell and apply its effects, that is kind of direct, but that means there is no standard way to actually cast a spell, because every spell has to be referenced uniquely in the spell book. There needed to be, and there still needs to be, a unified spell casting mechanic that should probably also tie into the game's core mechanic that casts 5th edition spells. There shouldn't be some reason why for this spell you roll an attack roll, and for this spell over here, no, they roll a save, for instance. This variant might not completely address that problem because it doesn't seek to completely rewrite the 5th edition spells, but I think it potentially goes some distance to that. So there may be some weirdness still in some of the spells that are written up because that's just how they are in 5th edition, but at least to cast a spell, you have to roll in order to get that spell off the ground. And I like that. I like that. Recovery is constant. Arcane spellcasters recover a set number of essence points per hour. Rest is not required to recover essence points. I like that as well, because, of course, the economy of hit points and different kinds of special powers and spell slots and things like that in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is highly tied to the short and long rest system, right? And we could get into that into a whole bunch of detail and what it means for the way that the game is actually played and how you explore dungeons and things like that, but it's certainly tied to that. But this breaks spellcasting away from that, which I like. If you are awake, or actually probably even while you're sleeping, you are going to be accumulating new essence points as the mana, or whatever it is exactly, the essence of the world seeps back into you after casting spells. You're not required to go through the structure of short rest and long rest. No spell level limit either. There is no limit to the level of spell that you may try to cast. Now, the key word there is try, which I also like. You may be able to cast it, but man, it is much higher than your level, and things might go badly if you try, but it's not just completely off limits arbitrarily, and I like that. There is only a limit on what spell you can safely cast. So there's a safety limit, but not maximum level. I like that. A first level character could, in theory, try to cast a 9th level spell. Even so, succeeding at the spell casting check is unlikely, and the essence point cost of casting such a spell might prove deadly. So see overcasting for that. And then the Fae, and this is kind of a setting-specific detail, but it says, in the Aetaltis setting, the Fae are part of civilized people in the Amethyst Sea Basin. They are not affected by standard 5th edition spells that call out Fae as a type of creature. That's setting-specific. But these other points were the way that this glyph magic changes 5th edition system, the 5th edition spellcasting system for arcane magic, and I really like it. So if you want to know more, let's go into this in more detail, because I want to look at it in more detail, because I'm thinking about adopting it for 5th edition. So let's take a look at the overview of Aetaltian magic here. This may say some of the same things that we just looked at in bullet point format, but it will sort of get us in here narratively as we start to look at all these different ideas. Magic on Aetaltis, especially arcane magic, works in a slightly different fashion than other 5th edition settings. The fundamentals are the same, but the spells found in your 5th edition sourcebook are fully compatible, but we've made some additions to the magic system to better reflect the nature of Aetaltian magic. It's a system you can easily layer on top of the basic 5th edition magic rules, and that's why I like it for potential adoption in all kinds of campaign settings. Arcane magic in Aetaltis uses the spell point system. Every character has a store of personal essence, and those characters with the talent and skill to manipulate that essence can use it to cast spells. Once a spellcaster's personal essence is expended, they must wait for the ambient essence around them to restore their supply of personal essence before they can cast more spells. To cast a spell, an arcane spellcaster spends the appropriate number of essence points and then makes a spellcasting roll. On a success, the spell goes off. On a failure, it doesn't. On a critical failure, however, a catastrophic spell failure occurs, which can add some fun, I think, and some danger, leading to a variety of potentially dangerous outcomes. Divine magic works as written in the basic 5th edition rules. It's safe, straightforward, and reliable, if a bit restrictive. And there is a whole nother book, the World of Aetaltis Adventurer's Guide, if you want to get into the in-universe explanation for the metaphysics of this magic in the Aetaltis universe. Now, there are also within Aetaltis some limitations on spells, which some people might want to adapt for their own campaigns if they think certain spells, such as dealing with teleportation, for instance, can be game-breaking. And so I think there's a strong argument potentially to limit some of the spells in the PHB anyway. So, impact of the ritual limitation and then other limitations. So because of the impact of the ritual of limitation, and this is an in-universe explanation for why certain spells do not operate inside the world of Aetaltis, there are these limitations. But we can just take a look at what the limitations are as kind of a meta-game kind of thing outside of the in-universe explanations for potential limitations on spellcasting that might prevent certain stories from being broken because of the spells. So here, there is no teleportation. Although, of course, there's no reason, I don't believe, that you couldn't adopt the spell-casting system and also leave off these spell limitations. But I think that the limitations that are on the spells that no longer function are part of what makes, well, I know it's what makes the Aetaltian magic work the way that, feel the way that it should feel in the context of the adventures that you have there. But it might be the kind of feel you want to have for your adventures as well, no matter what world you're playing in. So take these spell restrictions as a suggestion for this magic system, whether or not you apply the rest of the magic system to your game. So here there are no teleportation spells. Spells that move people, objects, or creatures from place to place without passing through physical space do not work on Aetaltis. This includes moving yourself, others, or bringing objects to you. Examples include teleport and dimension door. No summoning. You cannot summon creatures or objects from other planes in Aetaltis. Similarly, spells that banish creatures do not work since it's impossible to send creatures away from the physical plane. Elementals are an exception in this particular game world for different in-universe reasons. No gates or dimensional travel. Spells that open gates to other dimensions or transport you to other planes do not work. This applies to even minor spells like Dimension Door. The exception is travel to the essential plane, since it is not actually a different plane, but rather an unseen aspect of the physical plane. No long-distance communication. Spells that allow person-to-person communication or remote perception still work, but are limited to line of sight or the spell's range, whichever is shorter. If the target of a communication spell is hidden or beyond line of sight, it does not work. And then also limited detection. If the maximum range of a detection spell is greater than 60 feet, treat the spell as if it had a 60-foot range. When detecting a spell within range and line of sight, the spell works as written. When detecting a target within range but not visible, such as using a detect magic spell when a magic item is in a chest, the spell reveals that target exists somewhere within 60 feet, but no additional information is provided. Normal rules for material that blocks these types of spells still apply. So I really like the thought that's kind of gone into this, because blocking off certain types of spells may help you tell certain types of fantasy adventure stories that really get circumvented if you have, unlimited long-distance communication, gates, dimensional travel, and teleportation spells. The feel that you're imparting to the world is very different. And we've talked about that here on the channel when we're talking about the implications of having magic as far as world building and things like this. So, one answer is just to block off certain types of spells. Again, optional as far as the spellcasting system goes, but I think very interesting nonetheless. New attribute, essence points. If you are using this spellcasting system, then every living thing on Aetaltis, sentient or not, spellcaster or otherwise, has an essence point score. This score represents the living thing's store of personal essence. If you are an arcane spellcaster, you must expend these points to cast spells using the glyph magic system. There's a table here that shows your maximum essence points, your rate of essence point recovery, and the maximum spell level you can safely cast, because there's no maximum, but safely cast if you are an arcane spellcaster. So, level hit die, an individual or character's level of hit die, maximum essence points, rate of recovery, and maximum spell level. Let's take a look at that right here so we understand the implications here. At level 1, your spellcaster would have a maximum of 4 essence points, and you recover them 1 point per 2 hours. And the maximum safe level spell you can cast is first. Likewise, at second level, it is also maximum safe level of first level, but you increase your maximum essence to 6, and you're recovering them 1 per hour. At level 3, when you kind of get out of the apprentice phase of the levels in 5th edition, you now have a maximum essence score of 14. You are recovering 2 every hour, and you can now safely cast second level spells. So that keeps going up and up and up until level 20 spellcaster has 133 essence points and recovers 16 per hour and can cast 9th level spells. So you start to be able to safely cast 9th level spells up at level 17. So that's kind of the breakdown. I like looking at the lower levels because I like low-level play anyway. So we're looking at 4, 6, 14, 17, and we're talking about recovering them 1 an hour, once every 2 hours, or 2 every hour, or something like that. And that's, of course, in universe time. So arcane spellcasting glyph magic. Let's look at spellcasting checks. Casting a spell with glyph magic requires that you build an essence form called a glyph. When additional essence is directed to this glyph, the glyph's form shapes the essence, thereby creating a magical effect. Learning to successfully create glyphs and direct essence through them requires a natural affinity for sensing essence and years of intense training. Each time you use glyph magic to cast a spell, you must make a spellcasting check. So here's how you make a spellcasting check. Spellcasting DC is equal to 10 plus the unmodified essence point cost of the spell. So you're basing this on how many essence points the spell basically costs you to cast. The more essence points it requires, the harder the spell. Make the check at the end of the spell's casting time. On a success, the spell is cast and takes effect normally. On a failure, the spell fizzles and the attempt is wasted. Either way, reduce your essence points by the essence point cost of the spell. So even if you fail, you've got to pay the cost. What kind of modifiers go into adjusting the difficulty of the spell? And this is a part that I really like. Spellcasting check modifiers. Your bonus when making a spellcasting check equals your spellcasting ability modifier. That makes sense. Spellcasting ability modifier. Plus your proficiency bonus if applicable for your class. Wizards gain the proficiency bonus, but not all classes that cast arcane spells cast their proficiency bonus on spellcasting checks. So be aware of that, but in most cases, I'm thinking about wizards right here, so wizards would add their proficiency bonus. But then you can get advantage and disadvantage on spellcasting checks for a lot of reasons that I happen to think are very applicable to spellcasting. So what are positive circumstances that might provide advantage when you are casting a spell? Examples include referencing your spell book when casting a spell. I like that. If you actually have your spell book open and you are referencing the spell book as you are casting, you can get advantage on that check. It gives the spell book something else to do rather than just being the place where you log and archive a bunch of spells. I like that. There might be a reason why you might have it out when you're trying to cast a spell. Using particularly rare or especially high quality material components. So that also gives material components a range of things to do, because either most of the time in 5th edition, you either have them or you don't. And if you have your components with you, then you can cast your material component spells. If you don't, then you can't. But here, if you happen to be using particularly rare or especially high quality material components, hey, take advantage on your spellcasting check. I like that. Or doubling the time required to cast the spell. I'm a big proponent of using time as a resource more in RPGs. So if the wizard or other arcane spellcaster has the additional time and wants to take it, or maybe they're trying to cast a particularly difficult spell, doubling the amount of time to cast gives you an advantage. You're taking more time. You're being more careful. Now, of course, there are disadvantages to that, but in the context of spellcasting, the actual spellcasting roll, that would be an advantage. But there are also negative circumstances that might cause you to have disadvantage when casting a spell. Casting a spell without your arcane spell focus, your arcane focus. Not impossible, but you get disadvantage on the roll. Casting a spell while adjacent to an enemy. I like that. You need to be standing back to cast a spell. This is if they're adjacent to the enemy, they may be able to mess you up, so take disadvantage. Casting a spell while mounted or on a moving platform. I like that potential disadvantage as well. Using substandard, damaged, or inappropriate substances as material components. I like that as well. What if you're trying to scrounge something together to make it work? Well, it's better to me for like storytelling potentially and gameplay rather than having the spell components as a binary. You have them or you don't. You have them and they're adequate. You have them and they're rare and prized and extra good, so you get advantage. But on the other hand, well, you're having to scrounge together to get whatever you've got. They've been, your standard components have been taken from you. So take disadvantage because you're able to scrounge something together. Casting a spell when you don't have enough essence points to cover the cost. We're going to talk about that in a moment, because just because you've expended your essence points doesn't mean that you can't still cast an emergency spell. All right, but you're out of essence points. What do you got to do? Well, we'll talk about that. But one of the things you got to do is take disadvantage on it. And then casting a spell that is higher level than your maximum safe spell level. We know your maximum safe spell level, but if you're trying to cast something larger, hey, or higher level, you might need to. You might be in danger. Your party might be in danger. But take disadvantage on the spell, the spell casting check. Okay, critical success and failure. If you roll a 20 on your spellcasting check, it is a critical success. This brings back in critical success to spellcasting, because the warrior and the fighter and the barbarian get to score critical hits when they attack with their sword or axe, but because of the weird way that spellcasting is done in 5th edition, you may not or be able to get a critical result on your spell. If you're rolling to cast the spell, we were able to bring critical success in, not just on attack, but bring critical success into spellcasting and enjoy that aspect of the game. But likewise, if you roll a 1, you get a critical failure on your check. For people who like rolling dice and they enjoy the randomness of the D20, throwing in the critical success and the critical failure, and the people who really enjoy that part of the game probably will enjoy bringing that into the spellcasting as well. So this says, when you roll a critical success to cast a spell, the essence point cost for the spell is halved, rounding down. Critical success, pay only half. Be able to cast more spells. I like that. If you roll a critical failure when casting a spell, you pay the standard essence point cost and then roll on the spell mishap table. So we have spell mishaps right here. So when a spell mishap occurs, roll D100, a percentile, and add the modified essence point cost to the spell to the roll. This means that if you would cast a spell in a way that costs twice the number of essence points, add the doubled value to your roll. So the higher the more difficult the spell, the more complex the spell, the higher the level because it's costing more essence points, the greater potential when a mishap occurs that's going to be bad, right? If no duration is listed for a mishap, the effect is permanent. A remove curse or dispel magic might be able to remove the effect with the game master's permission. Be warned that many permanent spell mishaps are not curses or ongoing magical effects, but rather represent changes to the fundamental nature of reality. In that case, the effect is well and truly permanent. So, for example, lighter things or lesser things that might happen to you if you're rolling low after your modification, you extinguish every non-magical source of light in a 30-foot radius. Your eyes glow green for 1d6 hours. This does not affect your vision and provides no light to see by, but it does make you easy to spot in the dark. Going up, the seams on any backpack, pouches, or sacks you're carrying suddenly burst, scattering their contents on the ground around you. You drop into a deep magical sleep for 2d10 minutes. Nothing will wake you before that time. Your hands burst into flame, causing 1d4 damage. You suffer from the paralyzed condition for the next 1d6 rounds. The floor becomes greasy and slick. Treat the area as if affected by a grease spell centered on you. The spell goes off as normal, but targets a random person within range. The spell goes off as normal, but you suffer 1d4 points of corruption. Corruption, that's part of Aetaltis here. You increase your age by 2d20% of your current age. Game effects apply from age. You transform into a different lineage, that's like race or species in the world of Aetaltis, as if you've been brought back to life with a reincarnate spell. Your spirit up here at 113 to 114, or 111 to 112, you explode and immediately die. The splinters of tooth and bone cause 46 damage to everyone within a 20-foot radius. Victims that make a successful dexterity saving throw take half damage. Or 113 to 114, your spirit is torn from your body and thrust into the essential plane. Your body dies. Or, 115 to 116, you feel your bones crack and your flesh twist. Your arms and legs switch positions. The excruciating pain causes 5d6 damage. So, adds some risk to spellcasting, doesn't it? So when you're rolling, if you need an attack roll, your spellcasting roll for glyph magic doubles as your attack roll. So how much does it cost to cast spells? The essence point cost of spells. A glyph is formed from a bit of your core essence, but to create a spell effect, you must harness a far greater amount of essence. The more powerful the spell, the more essence required. This is reflected by the essence point cost for the spell. The unmodified essence point cost to cast the spell is based on level, as shown in the table below. So cantrips cost 0. Okay, makes sense. First level spells cost 2, unmodified. Second level 3, third level 5, fourth level 6, fifth level 7, 6, 9, 7, 10, 8, 11, and ninth level spells cost 13. So if your first level wizard is recovering 1 essence point every 2 hours, and you're out of essence points, then that means that you should be able to cast a first level spell every 4 hours, right? Once you're completely out. So by the way, some 5th edition spells allow you to choose the level at which you are casting a spell. Magic Missile, for instance, is one of them. When casting a spell of this type, use the essence point cost for the level at which you are casting the spell. That makes sense. Okay, what happens if you are out of essence points? If the essence point cost of the spell will reduce your essence points below 0, you can still cast the spell, but you must force it. When you force a spell, you reduce your essence points to 0 and then take hit points of damage equal to the number of points that you are short. You are, in effect, siphoning off the core essence that makes up your living spirit. The following are the rules applying for forcing a spell. First of all, you have disadvantage on your spellcasting check. You take a number of hit points of damage equal to the number of points that you are short. All normal game effects apply from taking damage, including dropping to 0 hit points. So involuntary forced casting. If circumstances, such as a spell's mishap result, increase the essence point of a spell to where the essence point cost is greater than your available essence points, pay the cost as if you had forced the spell. So let's take a look at overcasting, casting spells that are beyond your safe level. And I think this is a really cool part of the spellcasting system. You may attempt to cast spells that are higher than your maximum safe spell level. Your safe level is based on spellcasting class level as shown in the essence points recovery and safe spell level table. Right, we saw that. When casting a spell of a higher level than your safe spell level, the following rules apply. You must have learned the spell and have copied it into your spell book, so you must know it. Okay, makes sense. You must have the spell book out for reference. This is a requirement and does not provide advantage as it normally does. Makes sense. I like it. You have disadvantage on the spellcasting check. The essence point cost of the spell is doubled, although you still use the unmodified cost to determine the spellcasting DC. If a spell mishap doubles or triples essence point cost, multiply the modified essence point cost. For each level of difference between the level of spell you can safely cast and the level of spell you are casting, increase the critical failure range by 1. I think that's pretty cool. Let's take a look at this example of overcasting. So this is an example of casting a spell beyond your safe level. Wizik is the wizard, and his friends are racing to escape a mob of pursuing orc hunters. Dashing through a doorway and down a side corridor, they turn to lock the door behind them, only to realize there is no way to secure it. Although Wizik is only a first-level wizard, he learned the second-level arcane lock spell on their last adventure. He can only cast first-level spells safely, but this seems like enough of an emergency to accept the risk of trying something more difficult. I like players having this option. The DC for spellcasting check is determined normally. 10 plus 3 essence point cost equals DC 13, but he has disadvantage on the check. He also needs to get his spellbook out for reference. Since Arcane Lock is one level higher than Wizik can safely cast, the critical failure range is increased by the difference between the level he can safely cast first and the level of Arcane Lock second. Since the difference is 1, that is added to the range of critical failure, meaning a roll of 1 or 2 is a critical failure. Normally, the essence point cost to cast a second level spell is 3 essence points, but since Arcane Lock is beyond what Wizik can safely cast, the spell costs 6 essence points, double the normal cost. Wizik is currently at his maximum number of essence points, but at first level he has only 4 essence points. This means he's also forcing the spell and will take 2 points of damage to make up for the shortfall. Fortunately, he still has 3 hit points, so he won't drop him to 0 hit points, at least for now. With the orcs bearing down, Wizik pulls out his spellbook, takes a deep breath, and begins casting. So that basically sums up everything about the arcane casting system that is in the World of Aetaltis book. What do you think about it? I really like it, and I'm thinking about making it my go-to D&D arcane spellcasting system. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Love to hear from you.